For my essay project, I'm going to be examining Sembene's Black Girl and the way it reveals the enduring psychological and historical impact of colonialism on African migrants. To understand the world of Ousmane Sembene's Black Girl, I begin with Tyler Stovall's historical work from the book The Black Populations of France. Stovall points out that after World War II, France presented itself as a kind of universal, colorblind republic where anyone, including Africans from former colonies, could become quote-unquote French. But in reality, African immigrants were usually pushed into low-status jobs, especially domestic labor and servitude, such as dock workers and maids. Black migrants were expected to assimilate, but Black migrants quickly learned that fully belonging and equality were never guaranteed in this case. Stovall quotes that there was this constant pull to become like us, but don't expect to be one of us. This tension between opportunity and exclusion, the illusion of equality versus the reality of racism, is the exact space in which Sembene places Diawana in Black Girl. Now, turning to the film itself, Black Girl was released in 1966, and it follows Diawana, a young Senegalese woman who is hired by a French couple and travels with them from Dakar to France. In Diawana's mind, France is filled with the promise of opportunity, independence, and liberation. However, Diawana finds herself trapped in a small apartment, isolated, silenced, and reduced to just servitude. One of the first things you notice in the film is her silence. Whenever she is around the white French characters, she almost never speaks out loud. We only hear her voice and emotions through inner dialogue, which represents her lack of power in the situation. She's physically present, yet socially invisible. This idea connects with Francis Fanon's idea in his book Black Skin, White Mask. Fanon argues that language is a form of power, and quotes from his book that to speak is to exist absolutely for the other. He says the colonized person develops two dimensions, one within their own community, where their voice and identity are whole, and another with their white world, where they're constantly judged, silenced, or reshaped to fit colonial expectations. Fanon describes how the colonized person tries to assimilate, thinking that mastery of the French language or culture will grant equality. But instead, assimilation becomes a form of erasing one's identity. And that is exactly what happens to Diawana in France. She isn't allowed to exist with her African identity. Her power and voice only survive eternally. After Fanon, the symbolic moments in the film become even more clearer. Early in the film, we see Diawana receive the African mask from a neighborhood boy in Dakar. It's a gift, a kind of acknowledgement from her own community, a reminder of where she comes from and of the identity that surrounds her at home. But when Diawana arrives in France, the mask becomes something completely different. The French couple displays it on their wall like an exotic decoration, a conversation piece to impress guests. That shift from meaningful gift to empty object visually captures what the colonial gaze does. It strips African culture of its lived meaning and turns it into a decoration, something owned rather than something lived. Later, when Diawana begins to withdraw and refuses to work, the mask becomes the center of tension between her and her employer. That final struggle over the mask almost feels like a struggle for Diawana's identity. It's the only thing that truly belongs to her. And when the madam tries to repossess it, it highlights how thoroughly the French couple believe they own not just her labor, but her very sense of self. Then there's the scene where she meets the employer's children. The two younger kids shake her hand kindly, but the older child hits her hand away. The film almost quietly comments on how racism is taught and how colonial power is passed on through generations. The younger children are still innocent. They haven't absorbed the racial hierarchy yet. The older boy, though, already understands the power that whiteness gives him, and he uses it casually, almost instinctively, in this scene. And one of the most heartbreaking moments in the film is the letter from her mother. Because Diawana can't read French, her employer reads the letter out loud. He offers to write back, but instead of asking what she wants to say, he writes the letter for her, in his own words. Even her communication with home has to pass through him, her colonizer's voice. She can't express her feelings directly. She has to rely on the very people who silence her to speak on her behalf. Each of these scenes reflect Fanon's argument about how colonial power operates not just through laws or institutions, but through everyday interactions. And this is exactly the kind of power Sembene wanted to expose. In Diallo's interview with Sembene, he explains that Black Girl was born from a real case of a Senegalese domestic worker whose life was slowly consumed by this same pattern of subtle domination. He wrote the story in just 3 days, because, as he says, these small daily humiliations were not isolated incidents. They were part of the continuing legacy of colonial power that shaped African migrants' inner lives. So the scenes are Sembene's reconstruction of the real psychological violence that African migrants faced. In these colonial settings, African individuals were forced to surrender parts of their identities, piece by piece, until they could no longer fully recognize themselves. Also, in Embassy Dress Diop's interview, she talks about the criticism she received in Senegal after starring in the film as Diana, which makes this theme even stronger. She describes being judged harshly as if stepping into the role made her too modern or too shaped by European expectations. That backlash mirrors the film's storyline. Just like Diarwana, trapped between the colonial expectations on one side and social expectations from home on the other. Even though Ousmane's Sembene's Black Girl was released in 1966, the film remains strikingly relevant today, especially when we look at how it represents the lingering emotional and cultural effects of colonialism. The New York Times piece on its 50th anniversary restoration explains that the film still bears new questions, meaning its themes on immigration, domestic labor, racism, and the emotional cost of assimilation haven't faded at all. In fact, they feel even more relevant in modern France. It's a portrait of how colonial power continues to shape identity, voice, and belonging long after independence. The Times points out that Sembene reveals the violence of colonialism not through dramatic moments, but through the everyday interactions that seem harmless. Who gets spoken for, who gets corrected, and who gets ignored. That subtlety is what keeps the film powerful today. The film exposes how colonial power invades the smallest spaces of daily life, shaping identity in intimate and often invisible ways.